Hello everyone, Professor Sexton here with our video lecture on Sherwood Anderson's short story entitled Hands. This is going to be a very brief lecture, or at least that's my intention as we begin. So first of all, let me just give you some background information about this story. Hands is part of a longer work written by Sherwood Anderson, and it's an anthology called Winesburg, Ohio, and it was published in 1919. And what Sherwood Anderson does in this story, in this anthology, is he gives a collection of short stories all set in this fictional town of Winesburg, Ohio. So each story in the collection deals with a different character or different aspect of that fictional town that he's created. So as you go through the story, you get as you go through the entire work, you get little insights to the different people who make up this neighborhood. One of the first stories in the neighborhood, and one of the first stories in Sherwood Anderson's work is called Hands. Hands is a very interesting story. It essentially deals with two characters. The main character is a man by the name of Wing Biddlebaum. And Wing Biddlebaum is a man who lives in this town of Winesburg, Ohio, and he lives by himself. So he's a man who's somewhat isolated and alienated himself from nearly everyone else in the town. It is not unlike Emily Grierson and A Rose for Emily, the William Faulkner story that we've already talked about. But the reason for his isolation and alienation is a little bit different. One of the things that the story begins off by telling you and making clear is that the one thing that is characteristic of Wayne Biddlebaum is his hands. And so the narrator tells us that he has these nervous little hands that, are constantly moving and stuff like that. Um, and the whole story is about his hands, but it's more complicated than that because what you come to realize is that because of his hands is the reason why Wayne Biddlebaum is somewhat alienated and isolated from the neighborhood. The narrator tells us on the second page of the story that the story of Wayne Biddlebaum is a story of hands. Their restless activity, like unto the beating of the wings of an imprisoned bird, had given him his name. Some obscure poet of the town had thought of it. The hands alarmed their owner. He wanted to keep them hidden away and looked with amazement at the quiet, inexpressive hands of other men who worked beside him in the fields or passed driving sleeping teams on country roads. And so at the very beginning of the story, the narrator kind of sets you up to feel like there's some history behind Wing Biddlebaum's hands, and you don't really know what those details are. You know that he is a man who talks with his hands, yet there's some kind of apprehension or anxiety that he has concerning his hands. The story is divided up into two parts. The first part is the present of the story, and so it focuses on Wayne Biddlebaum, how he's been a member of this community for like 20 some years, but yet has never really established a close relationship or a friendship with anyone in the neighborhood. And it focuses also on his hands. The reason why is that he this anxiety with his hands. There's a young man in the town, a guy by the name of George Willard, who is also a reporter for the local newspaper. And George Willard is the one person in the neighborhood who Wayne Biddlebaum becomes closely attached to. Um, and there's something in this guy that there's an attraction there. It's not a romantic attraction, it's just like an intellectual attraction. And on page 11 of the story, the narrator gives us a little bit more detail. It says, out of the dream, Wayne Biddlebaum made a picture for George Willard. In the picture, men lived again in a kind of pastoral golden age. Across a green open country came clean limbered young men, some afoot, some mounted up on horses, and crowds of young men came together about the feet of an old man who sat beneath a tree in a tiny garden and talked to them. Um, and so Wing Biddlebaum sees himself as a teacher of sorts, and also a teacher where he wants to exist in this world full of men. And in a sense, too, where there's an older man who imparts wisdom to a younger man or younger men. And this is kind of like the same similarity between Wing and George Willard, because George is younger than Willard. And I mean Wing. And so when Wing begins to talk to George, all of a sudden he forgets this anxiety that he has with his hands. And so one day when the two of them are talking, he takes his hands and he touches George Willard. And he begins to caress the boy. And then all of a sudden, when he does this, there's this look of horror that comes into his face. And then he runs off, you know. And he goes and he cuts down any sense of building and establishing any type of relationship there. And what you then come to find out is that the story shifts. So what the story does is the story shifts and goes back into the past. And so it gives you this sense of a flashback. And in this flashback, you get the true story of Wing Biddlebaum. And one of the first things that you learn is Wing Biddlebaum is not his name. His real name is Adolf Meyer. And as Adolf Meyer, he used to be a school teacher in a small town in Pennsylvania. And as a school teacher there in Pennsylvania, he had this, I guess, what we would say um, with his male students. He always was touching his male students. Not, once again, not in a sexual way, not in a romantic way, but like because he is a man who talked so much with his hands. Whenever he would talk to a student, it was like his hands were on the student's shoulder and things of that nature. And what happened is there was a young boy at the school who kind of created in his mind a fantasy that did not exist. I mean, the way the story describes this is this, and this is on page 13. And then the tragedy. A half-witted boy of the school became enamored of the young master. In his bed at night, he imagined unspeakable things, and in the morning went forth to tell his dreams as facts. So, for this young boy, and the story describes him as half-witted, not an expression that we would use currently today, but in this boy's mind, he imagined something that was not there. And then he told other people. And then what this did was this raised alarm bells for other people in the society. And then essentially what happens is this: Adolf Myers is chased out of town, because there's a sense that his relationship with his students is unnatural, and that he was somewhat abusing them, you know. And so what happens is one afternoon, one of the men in the town, you know, called him out and started to beat Adolf Myers with his fists. And then they even had got a rope, because I think what they were going to do is they were going to lynch him. And this just really shook Adolf Meyer into shock, and he just ran away from the town. And that's how he ended up in Warrensburg, Ohio, where he ended up there staying with an aunt of his. Um, and what you come to realize is that for 20 years, he's lived in Winesburg, Ohio. And the narrator says he was only 40 years old, but he looked 65. When he got there, he was ill for a year. And then what he did was, because of the experience that he had in Pennsylvania, he changed his name. And so he picked up the name of Wing Bilderbaum. And you can see that in a way he's innocent, because he didn't really quite understand why the people in Pennsylvania had gotten upset. I mean, on page 14, the narrator tells us that although he did not understand what had happened, he felt that his hand must be to blame. And so this is the whole thing why this story is about his hands, like the sense that he talks with his hands and he touches people with his hands. And the thing that happened when he was a school teacher in Pennsylvania that caused him, you know, it was a matter of his life. These men were going to hang him, and at the last minute they decided not to. but it really sent him into a tailspin. Um, and so when he gets to Winesburg, Ohio, just because of the way that he talks so much with his hands, it keeps him from communicating and being a full part of the society. It's a very interesting story, because it's not one of those ones that you can easily point out what the theme is. I mean, it is a story about alienation and isolation. And let me just make a distinction between alienation and isolation, at least the way that I see them, because a lot of times we use these words interchangeably. I think of isolation as, think about isolation as this way, that if you're sitting in a room completely by yourself, you're isolated. But alienation can work when other people are not including you and not letting you be a part. So think about if you're at a party and there's like 50 or 60 people at that party, and they're all talking and chatting and laughing and having fun, yet you're at that party and you're not involved in that and you're alienated. Now, alienation can work two ways. Alienation can be self-guided, where sometimes you choose to alienate yourself, or in other ways it could be to a point where others alienate you and not include you. And let me give you another example of that. Let's just take a schoolroom situation, not a schoolroom situation, a cafeteria situation. As they said that there's a cafeteria table and there's a group sitting at the table, and someone else comes with their tray and sits down, and the other people at that table don't interact with that person, then in a sense, they are alienating that person. But yet at the same time, let's say that the person comes and sits down at that table and doesn't want to have anything to do with those other people, then in a way that person has alienated themselves. So it kind of it gets really tricky. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about Sherwood Anderson story Hands, is where this sense of alienation comes from, for the character of Wayne Biddlebaum, and how there's a fine line between him alienating himself, because that seems what he does in the story. Because it's not as if the people in the story of Winesburg, Ohio, don't want anything to do with him. It's more like he's afraid. And the reason that he's afraid is his hands. And it also kind of shows in the story how past actions and how people respond to things that you've done in the past can carry forth in the future. Because, as I said before, Wayne Biddlebaum has lived in this town for 20 years, and yet he's in the town, but he's not a part of the town. And so that's why this story becomes a very interesting story. As I've done with all the short stories that we read this course of the semester, this is just a brief overcap of the story. It in no way touches upon all the nuances of the story, because there's a lot more in the story that I just can't do in this lecture. But read the story for yourself, and then kind of take this lecture as a guide of things that you can look for, because your interpretation of it might vary from mine, which is completely fine, because that's the beauty of literature. So we don't all read it the same way. One of the things that I do want you to keep in mind of the story is the time period that is set in 1916. So it's very important to keep that in mind. All right, folks. I hope you enjoy Sherwood Anderson Hand's story, and have a good week. Bye.